We've seen it time and time again. Sexual abuse is swept under the rug in many organizations and churches today. It's something that we're ashamed of, so we want to hide it. The ministry of Speaking Truth in Love has a goal of really helping the church deal with this issue that we don't like to deal with. My guests are Dale and Faith Ingram, and this is their ministry. Guys, thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
I'm blown away at the statistics you gave in our last talk of between 25 and 33% of women have dealt with sexual abuse, not just mental or physical or verbal sexual abuse, and then 1 in 6 boys have dealt with sexual abuse. Okay, we heard about your story, Faith. This is something that is that you had to endure 8 years with your dad, who was a pastor. Right. Wow. What do you guys say to churches? Where's our jumping off point when you go, okay, churches, here's some things you need to know?
I would say one of the big things for churches to consider, I know as a pastor, I tell people that for most of my ministry, I was 95% ignorant about the issue of abuse. Meaning, I could give you a definition, but my understanding about abuse, we lived in New York, so we'd see something on the TV where a jogger in Central Park down in the city gets raped, someone on a bicycle gets raped. That was my concept mostly of sexual abuse. It was the stranger, the person you had to watch out for. Yet the statistics show the vast majority of all abuse is done by someone the child knows.
Wow.
And it can be a family member. We hear a lot of stories, older cousins, uncles, and it's not just men that are abusers now. We're hearing more and more women that are abusers. Churches need to be aware of that. There are so many things that believers don't even consider when it comes to the issue of sexual abuse. Statistically, there's not much difference between the church community and the non-church community.
Wow.
Which we see with a lot of other issues. So it's a major issue. Churches need to address it head on. And that's not being done for the most part. Once in a while you'll hear it, but no.
So start by saying, we're going to deal with this.
Right.
Yes.
So then you need to educate yourself on the issue. You also need to educate your children. The number one thing to protect your kids is to educate them, empower them, and encourage open communication with them. The biggest thing that I did not have when I was growing up was I was not empowered. I was told, children, obey your parents, for this is right. And I was also told, you always obey those in authority over you. I was never, ever given permission to say no. There was never a time that it was okay to say no. We need to let our kids know that they can set boundaries. They can say no when somebody is going to abuse them. They can, they don't have to kiss Uncle Joe. They don't have to, we give them the permission to say no. We give them permission to tell somebody when they're uncomfortable, to go to somebody, and it's not just a blanket, you obey no matter what, because we need to empower our kids so that if they're not with us 24/7.
Yeah.
And the people that are most likely to abuse them are people that they trust and know, not some stranger. So, and then we need to encourage open communication with our kids. We need to know what's going on in their lives. So we need to make sure that they're able to talk to us whenever they need to about whatever, and not make them feel that some subjects are not to be talked about. But we need to be open with them, and we need to ask them questions. How was your day? What happened when you went over to Johnny's house? Did you have a good time? What did you do? Those types of things keep the communication open so that they know that they can talk to us if they have concerns. And then we have to educate our churches on how to prevent abuse and how to recognize abuse victims, behaviors of victims and behaviors of offenders. We need to equip the church to make changes.
And this is literally what you guys do in your seminars. You go
Yes.
and equip the church. How long, you said we need to educate. Okay, you said now he's 95% ignorant.
Yeah.
Okay, how long would it take somebody to really educate themselves on this? How long is that boy, you got 12 books to read, or what does that really take to be educated?
I mean, I think you could take a 45-minute or an hour session where we go through a lot of the statistics. I mean, our eyes can be opened rather quickly.
Okay.
The real painful, complicated part comes when we're trying to deal with it.
Okay.
But awareness, people waking up and realizing, as we share, there are so many stories, so many examples. As we share some of those, people will come awake pretty quick. The slow part will be, now how do we deal with it?
Yeah,
What's the process?
that's the messy part.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Okay, so you guys go in, and that's exactly what you do. You make the church aware. You give them the statistics. How else do you help equip the church as you go through a process of teaching them?
Well, when churches, and this is really important, as they become aware, it's going to be very overwhelming for them. And let me give you a quick example. A guy named Bill Anderson wrote a book called When Child Abuse Comes to Church, a church of about 600 people. And he had a mom, he was there just a few weeks, and he had a mom come into his office with a little child. And she said, I think my child was abused here at church. And so he sat her down and she shared with him. He called the police. They reported it. By the time the investigation was done, this is in a church again of about 600 people. By the time the investigation was all done, Bill Anderson said in his book they had over 60 children, in his words, who were horribly sexually abused at church during the children's ministries by a 9-year-old boy and his older brother. See, these are the kind of things Christians have to wake up
Hang
to
on,
this issue.
by a 9-year-old boy and his older brother. So immediately my thought when you said 60 children, I'm going, wow, they're not checking their children's workers good enough. This is literally
Yeah.
by what we would call other children.
That's right. And they apparently were helping out with the nursery with the little kids, and apparently helping out with the bathroom breaks and different things. In most Christians, we're really naive to that. We're not thinking this child might
Yeah.
abuse the younger ones. That's what we have to become aware of, the reality of abuse. It is happening under our noses. It's happening in our own families and often in our own churches, and we don't even know it.
Wow. Unbelievable. Okay, so now you've got to start dealing with the issues, right?
Right. And you do need to set up prevention policies, and you have to follow them. It's not good enough to have a prevention policy. You need to follow them. And
Give me just a little bit of that. What does it look like to have a good prevention policy?
we use a prevention policy in our church called Plan to Protect.
Okay.
And it's a very extensive policy that can be, it can be, what do you want to say?
It's an extreme.
Well, you can get it to your church's, it can conform to whatever church, what your needs are. If you're a little church, you can do it differently than a big church.
Gotcha.
For example, a little church may only have one leader for every classroom, but the door has to be open or windows in the doors, and a hall monitor that goes around and monitors the classrooms. In a larger church, it's necessary for 2 people to be in every classroom.
So it's a really comprehensive material.
Yeah, it sounds like
Plan
it.
to Protect comes out of Canada.
Okay.
A lady by the name of Melody Bissell put the material together. She's in over 7,000 churches and organizations in Canada. She has the material for the United States now, just printed this year. But there's some other good material here in the States as well. And it's just important for churches to set up policies. It's important for them to do training every year. All the youth staff should be trained every year on what to watch out for in the children. Believers have to become aware of the fact that if they suspect abuse, if kids are disclosing to them, they need to report that to the law. There are so many mistakes being made. Most people are familiar with the Jerry Sandusky case up at Penn State. And people instinctively want to inform the higher ups and hope they do the right thing. But when, as a children's ministry worker, if someone discloses to you, now you can inform the higher ups, but you need to report.
So don't stop there. Don't just,
Exactly.
well, I
Right.
pass that information on.
Exactly.
Take a personal responsibility. And so you're talking to the high school student that learns of something to say,
Right.
hey,
Yes.
it's not enough just to go tell your parent that you saw
Right.
this or your youth pastor. Make sure and follow through on this because, well, after all, you wouldn't have had to write your book if this
Right.
wasn't a silenced thing.
Right. Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
And then when you have your youth workers, you do background checks, but that's not going to, even if somebody's an abuser, they may not show up on the background checks, only catch the ones that have been caught. So you do the background checks, but you don't just rely on those. You keep your eyes and ears open. Anything that's suspicious, you keep an eye on that. And anything that causes alarm, a lot of times we don't want to listen to those things that say, this doesn't seem right. We kind of want to minimize it and say, well, it couldn't be what I thought it was. They would never do that. But you need to listen to your instincts.
We had a couple that got a hold of us whose child was abused by one of the deacons in a church. And when it finally came out and the police were called and they did an investigation, there were a few people in the church that said, well, we saw the guy doing this or doing that, and we thought it seemed kind of odd, but they dismissed it as though it can't be what I think it is, or it can't be, because instinctively we don't want to believe that this person could be molesting a child. And so we tend to discount things that we should know should be a red flag. So it's important to report. Prevention's a big deal. Survivors of abuse in churches need to know that there's hope. In a lot of cases, they feel hopeless. They feel ashamed. They feel like what happened to them was partly their fault or mostly their fault. The offender, in the vast majority of cases, puts the guilt on them. But if you go back to Matthew chapter 18 and you read the first 14 verses, Jesus addresses the issue of child abuse very directly. He talks to the child who's been abused. He talks to the offender and warns the offender, or the would-be offender, not to abuse a child. Jesus even threatens the offender with what's going to happen to them if they harm a child. But he goes on to talk about the child. In verse 10 of Matthew 18, Jesus said that their angels always behold the face of my Father who's in heaven, which is telling me that the angels are there reporting to God on a daily basis what's happening to the children. And then Jesus in verse 11 goes into talking about the shepherd and the sheep. And in a number of instances, most of the instances in the gospel where Jesus talks about the sheep, it's about evangelism. But in this particular case, he's still talking about the little children. And he talks about the sheep that goes astray, the shepherd goes and finds it, comes back rejoicing. But in verse 14, Jesus says, neither is it the will of my Father who is in heaven that any of these little ones should perish. He's still talking about the little children. And what we have talked about for decades in our churches about young people leaving our churches in droves. We've been talking about that. It's been going on now for a couple of generations. I have come to believe very strongly that child abuse is one of the big reasons they're leaving the church. We quoted sexual abuse statistics, but if you throw into that mix the number of children who are physically abused, and I'm not talking about healthy biblical discipline, I'm talking about abuse. And when you throw those statistics in, you throw in the statistics about emotional abuse, kids being constantly screamed at by their parents, they're worthless, they're good for nothing, everything's their fault. You drum all that at these kids, and in many cases, we in the church reinforce all of those negatives. I think I've been guilty of doing that, especially in my early ministry. We rail on rebellious teenagers. Well, if you stop and think about someone who's been raped or molested, and in many cases repeatedly, how broken and devastated they are on the inside. It's like someone being hit with a car, and physically you see the devastation, the swelling, the bleeding, the broken bones. You see all of that, but they're like that on the inside.
Wow.
They're whole physically, they look okay physically, but emotionally they have been absolutely crushed, and the pain is unbearable. And in many of the things that we're seeing these kids do, when they go out and they cut themselves and they start to do drugs and even being promiscuous. I mean, there are so many things kids are going out and doing because they hate themselves. Abuse has so devastated them that they feel like they have nowhere to turn. And oftentimes we in the church are either silent at best, and at worst we're reinforcing all the negatives. And we put the blame and the shame back on them when it needs to go on the offender. So there's a lot of things I think as the church we've done wrong that we have to change it. We have to change the dynamic and start doing things the way God has told us to do them.
2 days ago I sat right here in this studio and I interviewed a young man who is now an evangelist full-time, and he told me his story of being abused as a child, and he was a cutter. And the scarring on the inside was huge. But I just need you to know something. There's hope. I sat with Johnny on this stage and interviewed him, and he is somebody who now shares the gospel with people every single week on the street. There really is hope. I'm tempted to let you right now, but we need to pause. And when we come back in part 3, I want Dale and Faith to actually talk right to you. Have you been abused? Are you an abuser? I want to find out what you'd say right to them, the abuser and the abused, and what you'd tell them about that hope, as well as some more information on how the church can deal with it. My guests today have been Dale and Faith Ingram. Dale is the author of Tear Down This Wall of Silence, a fabulous book. You can get that on their website, Speaking Truth in Love, speakingtruthinlove.org.
Correct.
Thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you in part 3.